Hi, uh, I'm Theo, but if you're watching this, I'm assuming you already know who I am, so I don't really need to introduce myself. But welcome to my YouTube channel, I suppose. Uh, I'm doing this mainly because reading is my favorite thing in the world and has been ever since I was a kid. And I frankly don't have an outlet to talk about it, talk about my thoughts of the stuff I read with a lot of people in my life without putting them to sleep or them wanting to punch me in the face. So that's why I'm doing this, just to kind of get all these thoughts out of my head so I can focus on more important things in life. Thank you especially to my good friends Dorian and Sophie, which I know are watching, so thank you very much for encouraging me to do this and for pushing me to do it too. Very kind of them, so special thanks. So today, on this very beautiful October day in Montreal, I want to be talking about one of my favorite authors, and I wanted to start with a short story. Short because I think it's a good intro to what an intro video should be, but also because I can give an opportunity to read the story, which I have at the end of the video. Because I realize not many of you are going to have access to the book or want to buy the book and whatnot. And even though I strongly recommend you do, I understand that. And so I gave a reading if you're interested for that at the end. But I wanted to talk about one of my favorite authors and one of my favorite short stories from that author, which is the Irish novelist, short story writer, and playwright James Joyce, who's an author who really doesn't need any introduction. He's a treasure of Ireland, and a mainstay of the modernist movement in the early 20th century. His ability to push the English language as he did, specifically with his novels Ulysses and especially Finnegan's Wake, is just completely reinvented the English language, in my opinion, and really pushed it to its finality, to its not its finality, I should say, but to its natural concluding point for the time period that the English language could have been pushed towards. He really broke it down to a breaking point, and made it and utilized its modularity in such a way that he was able to make works like Ulysses, like Finnegan's Wake, which have such ambiguous depth to them that especially books like Finnegan's Wake are still being studied like daily to this day. I remember like a few months ago I read that there was a book club, a Finnegan's Wake book club, and I'm sorry, I know this is not a video on Finnegan's Wake, but I just always love this story. And they read one page of Finnegan's Wake every day. That's how fucking hard it is, and it took them 28 years to finish the whole book. So shout out to this fucking guy. I don't know how the hell he did it. So I'm gonna try to give my 2 cents on some of his work, but Dubliners is definitely the most approachable of his work. It's the first published collection he made. He had published 3 of the short stories in here. I believe it was After the Race, Evelyn, and the Sisters, a few years before the publication of Dubliners. But this is the first major publication he made, which is a collection of 15 stories. They follow a trademark of his where by the end of the story, each protagonist, which is different in each story, but actually funny enough, some of them reoccur in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, I think. But each of them ends the story with an epiphany, a realization about their own life, about the state that they're in, or the state of Ireland. And this was done very purposefully by Joyce, because the intention of why he wrote Dubliners was, as he put it, I believe, to turn a mirror on Ireland and show them of their real ways, and I guess where they're going astray in many ways. But today I'm going to be reading only the third installment of the 15 in this book, and that is Araby. Araby falls into the earlier part of the book, so the protagonist is a child, and that's because the book follows a format where the protagonists increase in age by what point in the book you're at. So the first 3 stories are on children, and they eventually get older and older until you reach the dead, which at that time you feel like you've read an entire lifetime. But Araby is a very short story. It's only about six or 7 pages long. And it's basically a story about a little boy's infatuation with his friend's sister. That's about it. To the point where it compels him to go on this ridiculous quest for this person he barely knows. So as I mentioned before, I did a reading of the book that I'm going to attach at the end of this video. So if you'd like, before I get into like my thoughts on it, some analysis stuff, you can skip to that part and hear me read the story if you want to. If not, I'm just going to get into it. So Joyce often reminds, in Dubliner specifically, he reminds me a bit of Hemingway. Although this was published before Hemingway published anything, about a decade before. In some similarities, Joyce has that same unambiguity to his sentences as Hemingway does, although not as curt or as blunt as Hemingway's sentences tend to be. I find that his sentences, in Dubliners especially, are very dripping with conviction and are so sure of themselves, which helps add to the interiority of these characters being so believable, which is what makes it some of my favorite. But also paints the picture of how the words themselves are hardly ambiguous, but the big picture in and of itself is endlessly deep in ambiguity, which lends itself to so much interesting interpretation if you so choose. I think in this story specifically, that shows especially with a lot of the imagery and the motifs he uses, especially with the binary between darkness and light. We see the protagonist is often defined or enveloped by shadow, by darkness. He's often in shadows in his own house, in the back drawing room where a priest has died. He's in the shadows while he watches his uncle go home into the house, and as he watches Mangan's sister, his love interest. And I think it goes to show the isolation that this kid feels in his life, the detachment, which is further exemplified by some of the opening lines, which talk about the detachment of his house. He lives in a detached house, which is not connected to all the other houses, which sound like they're stuck together. And not to mention that he's also living with his aunt and his uncle. So further detached from what a typical family structure looks like. And this goes in stark contrast to the descriptions of Mangan's sister, who, when we first see her, is enveloped with the light of a doorway as she's standing on the steps of her house calling her brother Mangan in for tea. And again, over and over, as the protagonist describes her, especially when they meet, when they have their first proper conversation, he details the light as it caresses the back of her neck and illuminates her hair and the white borders of her clothes. And it goes to show that duality is so ever present, and that, at least in the eyes of the protagonist, that is the light that is lacking in the darkness of his life. But I think it also adds to a further complexity that Joyce is edging towards, and that is one of spirituality, which is often the case in his works. He was very, very concerned with the place of Catholicism in his life, as he explored in his partial autobiography, Portrait of the Young Artist as a Man. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Sorry, it's a mouthful. But also as it pertains especially to Irish life at the time. and the place the Catholic Church takes in Ireland and in the lives of people in Ireland, which I related to really a lot, because especially when I read these short stories, and when I read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man recently, Joyce's questions were a lot of the same questions I had and continue to have from when I was a kid, from when I was a teenager, going to an all-boys Catholic Jesuit school, as Joyce did as well in Ireland. And he doesn't shy away from that in this short story as well. And we see that with many different instances. For one, when the story starts, he details a remark that the boy makes of the noise that fills the streets when the Catholic's all-boys school ends the day. We also hear about the priest who's died in the back drawing room of his home, who used to own the home before he had. And later in the bazaar, when he walks through it. And in a lot of the imagery, I believe Joyce is trying to make it sound akin to a church. But after they close the lights and a silence sets on the bazaar, he describes the silence as that of one which pervades at the end of a church service. Which I think edges towards what the importance of what this story means to me. And that is that it's about the end of things, the end of childhood, the end of spiritual life. It's a bookend on childhood, a bookend on those specific sentiments, those specific youthful sentiments that we only really experience in childhood, that infatuation, and the strong love we can feel for someone, especially even in his case, as when we don't know them too well. And I think it's so beautifully conveyed, and just goes to show, which I think was a lot of what I took out of the child-oriented stories in Dubliners, is that how children are able to experience emotions just like adults can. The same emotional depth, and often feel them more profoundly than adults do, since it's their first time for a lot of situations like this. But just goes to show that they don't have the same emotional tool set or self-regulation that adults who are more trained in this as life goes on are able to. Which I think was such a touching sentiment that I only really understood when I gave this a reread a few weeks ago. Because I recall when I first read this initially, like about 3 years ago now, at the end of high school, I was quite frustrated when the book ends, because it ends with, of course, with him staring up into the darkness, and he doesn't complete his quest. He doesn't get anything for the girl, and he realizes how stupid he's being, and it just ends with him being angry and miserable. And I think that's because I missed a very specific detail that the protagonist missed as well. And that's halfway through the story, when he has the conversation with Megan's sister, and he asks her, why can't she go to the bazaar? And she says, it's because I have a retreat with my convent. And that's because she's training to be a nun, which, you know, Catholicism, big no-no, can't get with anyone. No fun being a nun. And clearly the protagonist misses this, because he would have known that that was just a closed door as soon as she said that. And I missed it too, and I ended up being frustrated. And if the reader misses this, I find they'll be just as frustrated as the protagonist will. But when I did catch it this time around, it added that extra layer of just, I suppose, understanding and retrospection to a lot of my own youthful experiences in that regard. But the other thing I noticed is that it's also a Grail quest, which I was so surprised when I noticed. And I wish I noticed it the first time, because it was pretty fun to pick apart. You know, of course, the protagonist, he's meeting this fair maiden with bright blonde hair who sends him on a quest to this very exotic place, and he has to retrieve this MacGuffin-like thing, his own chalice. And I realized through a few passages in here, at some point when he's doing marketing with his aunt, he describes the experience of carrying the parcels almost like bearing a chalice, as he's walking through these hordes of drunken men and prostitutes, and a lot of the screaming merchants and all the noise and bustling activity of Dublin. And also, like, at another point when I think it only clicked with me when I was rereading the conversation with him and the sister, and she's leaning on the rail and breaks the pike off the rail, and she hands it to him and says, "I think this suits you well." And that really puzzled me when I first read it, I recall, but now it's almost like the Lady of the Lake presenting Excalibur to King Arthur, sending him on this quest, and which I think also ties into why Araby is an Oriental bazaar. I thought it was maybe some point of like Western fetishism over that stuff, but I really think it has to tie into that Grail parallel and the emotional journey that this kid is going on, where he's really pushing himself out of his comfort, where he's really pushing himself out of everything he knows into this distant place where he has no expectations of, and which kind of glitters in his mind with all these different idealistic images of what it's going to look like, and which is ultimately crushed by the time he gets there and he sees how typical, how sterile it is, just like his infatuation was with this woman. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the story. If you choose to hear my voice reading it, and hopefully I'll publish a new video soon with my first proper review of a novel that I'll be reading. So,
Araby by James Joyce. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. The former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in the back drawing room. Air, musty from having been long enclosed, hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was littered with old, useless papers. Among these I found a few paper-covered books, the pages of which were curled and damp. The Abbot, by Walter Scott, The Devout Communicant, and the Memoirs of Vidocq. I liked the last best because its leaves were yellow. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the last tenant's rusty bicycle pump. He had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he had left all his money to institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. When the short days of winter came, dusk fell before we had well eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses had grown somber. The space of sky above us was the color of ever-changing violet, and towards it the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. The cold air stung us, and we played till our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The career of our play brought us through the dark, muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough tribes from the cottages, to the back doors of the dark, dripping gardens where odors arose from the ash pits, to the dark, odorous stables where a coachman smoothed and combed the horse, or shook music from the buckled harness. When we returned to the street light from the kitchen windows had filled the areas. If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until we had seen him safely housed. Or if Mangan's sister came out on the doorstep to call her brother in to his tea, we watched her from our shadow peer up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we left our shadow and walked up to Mangan's steps resigningly. She was waiting for us, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Her brother always teased her before he obeyed, and I stood by the railings looking at her. Her dress swung as she moved, and the soft rope of her hair tossed from side to side. Every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash so that I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leaped. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I'd never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. Her image accompanied me even in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings, when my aunt went marketing, I had to go carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, amid the curses of laborers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by the barrels of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers who sang a Come All By You about O'Donovan Rossa, or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. These noises converged in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears. I could not tell why, and at times a flood from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought little of the future. I did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not, or, if I spoke to her, how I could tell her of my confused adoration. But my body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires. One evening I went into the brick drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken panes I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, of fine, incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and, feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love, many times. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me, was I going to Araby? I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, she said. She would love to go. And why can't you, I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet round and round her wrist. She could not go, she said, because there would be a retreat that week in her convent. Her brother and 2 other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alone at the railings. She held one of the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curves of her neck, lit up the hair that rested there, and, falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood at ease. It's well for you, she said. If I go, I said, I will bring you something. What innumerable follies lay waste my waking and sleeping thoughts after that evening. I wished to annihilate the tedious intervening days. I chafed against the work of school. At night in my bedroom and by day in the classroom, her image came between me and the page I strove to read. The syllables of the word, Araby, were called to me through the silence in which my soul luxuriated and cast an Eastern enchantment over me. I asked for leave to go to the bazaar on Saturday night. My aunt was surprised and hoped it was not some Freemason affair. I answered few questions in class. I watched my master's face pass from amiability to sternness. He hoped I was not beginning to idle. I could not call my wandering thoughts together. I had hardly any patience with the serious work of life, which, now that it stood between me and my desire, seemed to me child's play. Ugly, monotonous child's play. On Saturday morning, I reminded my uncle that I wished to go to the bazaar in the evening. He was fussing at the hall stand, looking for the hat brush, and answered me curtly, Yes, boy, I know. As he was in the hall, I could not go into the front parlor and lie at the window. I left the house in bad humor and walked slowly towards the school. The air was pitilessly raw, and already my heart misgave me. When I came home to dinner, my uncle had not yet been home. Still, it was early. I sat staring at the clock for some time, and when its ticking began to irritate me, I left the room. I mounted the staircase and gained the upper part of the house. The high, cold, empty gloom rooms liberated me, and I went from room to room singing. From the front window, I saw my companions playing below in the street. Their cries reached me, weakened and indistinct, and, leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour seeing nothing but the brown-clad figure cast by my imagination, touched discreetly by the lamplight at the curved neck, at the hand upon the railings, and at the border below the dress. When I came downstairs again, I found Mrs. Mercer sitting at the fire. She was an old garrulous woman, a pawnbroker's widow who collected used stamps for some pious purpose. I had to endure the gossip of the tea table. The meal was prolonged beyond an hour, and still my uncle did not come. Mrs. Mercer stood up to go. She was sorry she couldn't wait any longer, but it was after 8 o'clock, and she did not like to be out late at night, for the air was bad for her. When she had gone, I began to walk up and down the room, clenching my fists. My aunt said, I'm afraid you may have to put off your bazaar for this night of our Lord. At 9 o'clock, I heard my uncle's latchkey in the hall door. I heard him talking to himself and heard the hall stand rocking when it had received the weight of his overcoat. I could interpret these signs. When he was midway through his dinner, I asked him to give me the money to go to the bazaar. He had forgotten. The people are in bed, and after their first sleep now, he said. I did not smile. My aunt said to him energetically, can't you give him the money and let him go? You kept him here late enough as it is. My uncle said that he was very sorry he had forgotten. He said he believed in the old saying, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. He asked me where I was going, and when I had told him a second time, he asked me, did I know the Arab's farewell to his steed? When I left the kitchen, he was about to recite the opening lines of the piece to my aunt. I held a florin tightly in my hand, and as I strode down Buckingham Street towards the station, the sight of the streets thronged my buyers and glaring with gas recalled to me the purpose of my journey. I took my seat in a third-class carriage of a deserted train. After an intolerable delay, the train moved out of the station slowly, crept onward among ruinous houses and over the twinkling river. At Westland Row Station, a crowd of people pressed at the carriage doors, but the porters moved them back, saying that it was a special train for the bazaar. I remained alone in the bare carriage. In a few minutes, the train drew up beside an improvised wooden platform. I passed out onto the road and saw by the lighted dial of a clock that it was 10 minutes to 10. In front of me was a large building which displayed the magical name. I could not find any sixpenny entrance, and fearing that the bazaar would be closed, I passed in quickly through a turnstile, handing a shilling to a wary-looking man. I found myself in a big hall, girdled at half its height by a gallery. Nearly all the stalls were closed, and the greater part of the hall was in darkness. I recognized a silence like that which pervades a church after a service. I walked into the center of the bazaar timidly. A few people were gathered about the stalls, which were still open. Before a curtain over which the words Café Chantant were written in colored lamps, two men were counting money on a salver. I listened to the fall of the coins. Remembering with difficulty why I had come, I went over to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flowered tea sets. At the door of the stall, a young lady was talking and laughing with two young gentlemen. I remarked their English accents and listened vaguely to their conversation. Oh, I never said such a thing. Oh, but you did. Oh, but I didn't. Didn't she say that? She did, I heard her. Oh, there's a fib. Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me, did I wish to buy anything? The tone of her voice was not encouraging. She seemed to have spoken to me out of a sense of duty. I looked humbly at the great jars that stood like Eastern guards at either side of that dark entrance to her stall and murmured, no, thank you. The young lady changed her position of one of the vases and went back to the two young men. They began to talk of the same subject. Once or twice the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder. I lingered before her stall. Though I knew my stay was useless, to make my interest in her wares seem the more real. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the two pennies to fall against the sixpence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery that was light out. The upper part of the hallway was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger.